Maria Rodriguez was the kind of person you might pass on the street without giving a second glance. She wasn't flashy or loud, just an ordinary woman in her late 30s, dressed in a faded floral dress and worn-out sandals that had seen better days. Her handbag was small, practical, and well-used like everything else she carried with her. Today, however, Maria wasn't heading to the market or catching a bus to visit family. Instead, she found herself walking down the jet bridge toward the door of a luxurious international flight. This wasn't just any flight. It was a first-class journey across continents, reserved for those who could afford opulence in the skies. The passengers boarding alongside her were dressed to impress, men in sharp suits, women dripping in diamonds, and children clutching iPads encased in designer covers. It was clear from their demeanor that they belonged here. They oozed confidence, wealth, and entitlement. And then there was Maria, standing quietly at the edge of it all, looking like she'd been plucked from a completely different world. The flight attendants greeted each passenger warmly as they stepped aboard, but when Maria approached, their smiles seemed to falter slightly. Not because they weren't polite, they were impeccably trained, but because she looked so out of place. One attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second before guiding her to her seat near the window. As Maria settled in, pulling out a dog-eared, paperback novel from her bag, the whispers began. "Who is she?" A woman in a silk scarf whispered to her companion, her voice low but not quite soft enough to avoid being overheard. "Did someone make a mistake?" "She looks like she belongs in economy." Another man leaned back in his leather seat, chuckling under his breath. "Maybe she won some contest or something. You know how airlines do those promotions." The comments spread like wildfire through the cabin, growing bolder with every passing moment. A young couple seated nearby exchanged smirks, while an older gentleman shook his head disapprovingly. Someone even let out a snicker loud enough for Maria to hear. But if she noticed, she didn't show it. She simply adjusted her glasses, turned a page in her book, and stared out the window at the tarmac below. What the other passengers didn't realize was that Maria wasn't oblivious to their remarks. In fact, she heard every word. But instead of feeling hurt or embarrassed, she felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't the first time people had judged her based on appearances, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Over the years, she'd learned to let such things roll off her back. After all, what did it matter what strangers thought? They didn't know her story, and she wasn't about to waste energy trying to explain it. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Maria closed her book and tucked it back into her bag. She glanced around the cabin, taking in the polished faces and expensive accessories. These people lived in a different reality than hers, one filled with privileges she couldn't imagine. Yet despite their wealth and status, she noticed something missing, a certain warmth, a genuine connection to the world around them. They seemed more concerned with appearances than substance, more interested in mocking than understanding. Little did they know, their assumptions about Maria would soon come crashing down. For beneath her modest exterior lay a truth that none of them could have guessed, a secret that would turn their judgments upside down and teach them a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. But for now, Maria kept her thoughts to herself, content to wait and watch as the drama unfolded around her. The engines roared to life and the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. Inside, the tension simmered quietly, unnoticed by most, but palpable nonetheless. Something was brewing in the air, and Maria knew it. She just smiled softly to herself, knowing that sometimes life has a way of leveling the playing field in the most unexpected ways. As the plane taxied down the runway, the hum of anticipation filled the cabin. The first-class passengers were settling into their plush seats, adjusting their seatbelts and preparing for the long journey ahead. Some sipped on champagne, others scrolled through their phones, and a few exchanged small talk about their destinations or business deals. But one thing was certain. They all still couldn't shake off the mystery surrounding Maria. The whispers had died down temporarily, but the curiosity lingered like an unspoken question hanging in the air. Who was this woman? Why was she here? And why did she seem so unfazed by the obvious disdain directed her way? These thoughts buzzed quietly in their minds as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking the silence. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome aboard Flight 407 to London Heathrow. On behalf of our entire crew, I'd like to thank you for choosing to fly with us today. The announcement started off routine enough. Standard greetings, reminders about safety procedures, and reassurances about smooth flying conditions. But then something unusual happened. The captain paused briefly before continuing, his tone shifting ever so slightly. "We have a very special guest traveling with us today," he said, his voice warm and deliberate. "Mrs. Maria Rodriguez is joining us on this flight, and I personally want to ensure her journey is nothing short of exceptional." The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers froze mid-sip, mid-scroll, mid-conversation. Heads turned, sharply toward Maria, who sat calmly by the window, her hands resting gently on her lap. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound came from the engines outside, growing louder as the plane sped closer to takeoff. Then slowly, the murmurs began, again this time tinged with confusion and disbelief. Did he just say, "Maria Rodriguez"? A middle-aged man in a tailored suit whispered to his neighbor, his brow furrowed. "That can't be right. Is that really her name?" "I thought maybe it was a coincidence." Another passenger chimed in, leaning forward, conspiratorially. "But now I'm not so sure." A younger woman seated nearby frowned, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head. "Wait a minute," she said, raising her voice slightly. "Do we even know who she is? Because she doesn't exactly scream VIP." Her comment drew nervous laughter from a few others, though it lacked the earlier confidence. Something about the captain's announcement had thrown them off balance. One particularly bold traveler, a tall, silver-haired businessman with an air of authority, decided to get answers. He flagged down a passing flight attendant with a flick of his finger. When she approached, he leaned in close, lowering his voice but making sure those around him could still hear. "Excuse me," he began, his tone polite yet firm. "I couldn't help but notice the captain mentioned someone named Maria Rodriguez. Is there a reason she's being singled out? Is she important somehow?" The flight attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. She glanced briefly at Maria, who remained oblivious, gazing out the window at the darkening sky. Then she smiled, a practiced, professional smile that gave nothing away. "All I can say, sir, is that Mrs. Rodriguez is indeed a valued guest," the attendant replied smoothly. "Beyond that, I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to discuss further details." Her response only deepened the intrigue. Valued guest? What did that even mean? Was Maria a celebrity, a philanthropist, or perhaps someone connected to the airline itself? The possibilities swirled in the passengers' minds, each theory wilder than the last. "She must be related to someone high up," muttered a young tech entrepreneur seated across the aisle. "Maybe a relative of the CEO or something. Otherwise, why would the captain make such a big deal about her?" "Or maybe she won some ridiculous lottery," suggested a woman in a sequined blazer, tapping her manicured nails against her glass of wine. You know how these companies love their PR stunts. But none of their guesses felt quite right. There was something about the situation that didn't add up. If Maria was truly a nobody, why go to such lengths to acknowledge her? And if she was someone significant, why wasn't she flaunting it? Meanwhile, Maria herself seemed entirely unaffected by the commotion. She hadn't reacted when the captain announced her name, nor did she appear bothered by the renewed scrutiny from her fellow passengers. In fact, she looked almost amused, as if she knew something they didn't. Every now and then, she'd glance up from her book, her lips curling into a faint smile before returning to the page. This calm demeanor only added fuel to the fire. How could she sit there so serenely while everyone else scrambled to piece together the puzzle? It was maddening and fascinating all at once. As the plane lifted off the ground, climbing higher and higher into the night sky, the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The first-class section, usually a haven of luxury and relaxation, had transformed into a hotbed of speculation and unease. No one could focus on their meals, their movies, or their work emails. All eyes kept drifting back to Maria, trying to decipher the enigma sitting quietly among them. And then, just as the initial excitement began to wane, the cockpit door opened. Out stepped the captain himself, his junior. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had shifted dramatically after the captain's unexpected visit. The earlier whispers of mockery were replaced by an uneasy silence, punctuated only by the faint hum of the plane's engines and the occasional clink of silverware as meals were served. Every passenger felt it, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them like a storm cloud threatening to burst. Maria remained unfazed, sipping her glass of water and nibbling on a piece of bread from the gourmet meal laid out before her. She seemed completely at ease, almost as if she were alone in the cabin rather than surrounded by dozens of curious and increasingly anxious eyes. Her calm demeanor was maddening to those around her. How could she sit there so peacefully while their minds raced with questions? One man, seated 2 rows ahead, couldn't take it anymore. He was a wealthy businessman used to being in control and having answers for everything. His sharp suit and Rolex screamed authority, but tonight he felt anything but powerful. Leaning over to his wife, he muttered under his breath, "This doesn't make any sense. Why is everyone treating her like royalty? What are we missing?" His wife shrugged, equally perplexed. Maybe she donated a ton of money to the airline or something. But even then, why all the fuss? Their conversation caught the attention of nearby passengers who nodded along silently. They weren't just curious, they were desperate for clarity. The mystery of Maria Rodriguez gnawed at them, eating away at their confidence and composure. Finally, unable to contain himself, the businessman decided to confront Maria directly. After all, he reasoned, what harm could come from asking a simple question? Straightening his tie, he turned slightly in his seat and addressed her in a tone that tried and failed to sound casual. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure others could hear. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but do you have any idea why the captain singled you out earlier? It's just unusual." The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Maria's response. For a moment, she didn't react. She finished chewing her bite of food slowly, wiped her mouth delicately with a napkin, and then looked up at him with a polite smile. "Oh, I'm sure it's just a courtesy," she replied softly, her voice calm and measured. "Nothing to worry about." Her answer was vague, almost dismissive, leaving the businessman more frustrated than satisfied. "A courtesy?" he echoed, his brow furrowing. "But isn't this level of attention usually reserved for, well, someone important?" Maria tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Important? That depends on how you define it, doesn't it?" she said lightly, as though discussing the weather. Then, without elaborating further, she returned her focus to her meal, effectively ending the conversation. The businessman sank back into his seat, flustered. Around him, other passengers exchanged awkward glances. Some looked embarrassed for him. Others seemed relieved that they hadn't been bold enough to ask themselves. But one thing was clear. Maria's refusal to explain herself only deepened the mystery. As the hours passed, the tension in the cabin continued to simmer. A few passengers attempted to distract themselves with movies or books, but their efforts were half-hearted at best. Their thoughts kept circling back to Maria, replaying every interaction, every detail they'd observed since boarding the flight. One woman, dressed in an elegant silk blouse and diamond earrings, leaned toward her companion and whispered, "Do you think she's secretly famous, like maybe she's a writer or an artist who doesn't care about showing off?" Her friend shook her head. "No way. Famous people always act like they own the place. She's too humble." "Well, maybe she's related to someone famous," another chimed in. "Like a niece or cousin of some big celebrity." The theories grew wilder with each passing minute, reflecting the growing desperation of the group. They wanted, no, needed, an explanation. Not knowing was driving them crazy. Meanwhile, Maria appeared blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing around her. She ate her meal leisurely, occasionally glancing out the window at the endless expanse of clouds below. When the flight attendants offered her more wine or dessert, She declined politely, thanking them with a warmth that contrasted sharply with the frosty energy radiating from the other passengers. At one point, a young couple seated near her tried to strike up a friendly conversation. "So where are you headed?" the man asked, forcing a smile. "London," Maria replied simply, her tone pleasant but guarded. "Ah, London. Business or pleasure?" the woman prodded, hoping to uncover some clue. "Just visiting," Maria said, her lips curving into a small, enigmatic smile. "It's nice to travel sometimes, isn't it?" The couple nodded awkwardly, unsure how to respond. Once again, Maria had managed to deflect their curiosity without revealing anything substantial. By now, the first-class section had devolved into a strange mix of frustration and fascination. Some passengers began to feel guilty for their earlier behavior, realizing that mocking someone based solely on appearances wasn't exactly commendable. Others doubled down on their resentment, convinced that Maria was deliberately withholding information just to torment them. And then, just when it seemed like the tension might reach a breaking point, the cockpit door opened once again. This time, however, it wasn't the captain who emerged, it was someone else entirely. Someone whose presence would change everything. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped into the aisle, his tailored suit and confident stride immediately drawing attention. Several passengers gasped audibly as they recognized him. It was Alexander Hartley, the billionaire CEO of the very airline they were flying on. Heads turned, jaws dropped, and whispers erupted across the cabin. What was he doing here? And why did he look like he was heading straight toward Maria? The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, but not in the way anyone expected. The moment Alexander Hartley stepped into the aisle, the first-class cabin fell utterly silent. It wasn't just his presence that stunned everyone, it was the sheer aura of authority and power he carried with him. Alexander Hartley wasn't just any CEO. He was a legend in the aviation industry, known for turning his airline into one of the most luxurious and reliable carriers in the world. His face had been plastered on magazine covers, and his name was synonymous with success. Yet here he was, walking through the narrow aisle of a commercial flight like an ordinary passenger. But this wasn't what shocked the passengers the most. What truly left them speechless was the direction he was heading, straight toward Maria Rodriguez. Maria didn't seem surprised to see him. In fact, as he approached her seat, she set down her book and smiled warmly, as if greeting an old friend. The contrast between their appearances couldn't have been starker. Alexander in his perfectly tailored suit, exuding wealth and influence, and Maria in her simple floral dress, radiating quiet humility. And yet, when Alexander bent down slightly and kissed her cheek, it became painfully clear to everyone. They weren't just acquaintances. "Darling," Alexander said softly, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "I hope you're comfortable. I wanted to check on you personally." For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Darling. He had called her darling. The same woman they had mocked, judged, and dismissed as someone who didn't belong. Now here she was, sitting beside the man who owned the entire airline, being addressed with such affection and respect. The first-class passengers stared in disbelief, their faces pale with horror. One by one, the reality dawned on them. Maria Rodriguez wasn't just a random traveler. She was married to the Alexander Hartley. The whispers that had started earlier now erupted into frantic murmurs, each person trying to process the bombshell revelation. "Oh my God," a young woman whispered, her hands flying to cover her mouth. That's her, the wife of the CEO." A businessman seated across the aisle slumped back in his seat, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and dread. "We've been laughing at the CEO's wife this whole time," he muttered under his breath, his voice trembling. "What have we done?" Others exchanged horrified glances, their earlier arrogance replaced by panic. Some buried their faces in their hands while others frantically tried to recall every rude comment they'd made about Maria. Every snicker, every judgmental remark, every condescending glance. It all came rushing back, hitting them like a tidal wave of regret. Alexander, meanwhile, remained unfazed by the chaos unfolding around him. He took a seat next to Maria, his posture relaxed and confident. Turning to her, he asked casually, "How's everything going so far? Any issues I should know about?" Maria shook her head, her smile gentle but knowing. "Everything's perfect. Alex, thank you." Her casual use of his nickname only added fuel to the fire. These two weren't just husband and wife, they clearly shared a deep bond, one built on mutual love and respect. To the other passengers, it was almost unbearable to watch. How could they have misjudged her so completely? How could they have failed to see? The silence in the first-class cabin was deafening. It wasn't the comfortable kind of quiet you'd expect on a long flight. It was heavy, oppressive, and filled with unspoken guilt. The passengers sat frozen, their minds racing as they replayed every moment since boarding. Every sneer, every whispered insult, every judgmental glance now felt like a dagger aimed directly at themselves. They had mocked Maria without knowing a single thing about her, and now they were paying the price for it. Maria, however, seemed completely unfazed by the weight of the situation. She turned another page in her book, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if she were alone in the cabin rather than surrounded by a group of people drowning in regret. Her calmness only made the tension worse. How could she sit there so peacefully while everyone else squirmed under the weight of their own shame? One by one, the passengers began to crack. A middle-aged woman dressed in an expensive silk blouse dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her mascara smudging slightly. "I can't believe we did that," she murmured to no one in particular, her voice trembling. "We treated her like she didn't belong here." Her companion, a man in a tailored suit who had earlier joked about Maria winning a contest, nodded solemnly. "It's my fault," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I started it. I said those things out loud, and everyone else followed along. What must she think of us?" Nearby, a younger couple exchanged guilty glances. The man leaned over to whisper something to his partner, but she shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "Don't even try to justify it," she whispered back harshly. "There's no excuse for what we did. We judged her based on how she looked, and now we're sitting here realizing how wrong we were." The whispers spread throughout the cabin, growing louder as more passengers joined in. Some tried to rationalize their behavior, claiming they hadn't meant any harm. Others openly admitted their mistakes, their voices thick with emotion. But no matter how they phrased it, the truth was undeniable. They had misjudged Maria, and in doing so, they had revealed the worst parts of themselves. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, a bold passenger decided to take action. It was the same businessman who had confronted Maria earlier, demanding to know why the captain had singled her out. Now his face was red with embarrassment as he stood up from his seat and approached her row. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he began hesitantly, his voice shaking. I need to apologize. Earlier, I asked you questions that came across as rude, and I'm truly sorry for that. I didn't mean to offend you." Maria lowered her book and looked up at him, her expression neutral. For a moment she said nothing, letting the weight of his apology hang in the air. Then, with a small nod, she replied softly, "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Her response was simple, almost dismissive, but it was enough to break the dam. One by one, other passengers rose from their seats, forming a hesitant line near Maria's row. Each of them offered their apologies, their words stumbling over each other in their rush to make amends. "I'm so sorry for laughing at you earlier," said a young woman, clutching her hands nervously. "You didn't deserve that." "Please, forgive me," another added. "We had no idea who you were, and even if we did, it shouldn't have mattered. We should have treated you with respect from the start." Maria listened patiently, her expression softening with each apology. She didn't interrupt or lecture them. Instead, she simply nodded and thanked them, her tone gentle but firm. To the passengers, her quiet grace was both comforting and humbling. Here was a woman who had every right to be angry, to lash out or demand accountability, and yet She chose compassion instead. As the last passenger returned to their seat, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted once again. The tension eased slightly, replaced by a sense of collective reflection. The first-class section, which had once been a showcase of privilege and entitlement, now felt like a classroom where everyone had just learned a hard lesson. A flight attendant approached Maria cautiously, offering her a fresh glass of water. "Is there anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern. Maria smiled and shook her head. "No, thank you. Everything is fine." The flight attendant lingered for a moment, clearly wanting to say more, but ultimately decided against it. Instead, she gave Maria a small, respectful nod before moving on to assist other passengers. For the rest of the flight, the cabin remained unusually subdued. Conversations were sparse, and when they did occur, they were conducted in hushed tones. Many passengers spent the time lost in thought, replaying the events of the evening in their minds. Some jotted notes in their journals, perhaps vowing to change their behavior going forward. Others simply stared out the window, watching the endless expanse of clouds drift past. Maria, meanwhile, continued reading her book, occasionally pausing to glance out the window herself. If she noticed the change in the cabin's energy, she gave no indication of it. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had shown since boarding, as though she understood that true strength lies not in seeking revenge, but in rising above pettiness. By the time the plane began its descent into London Heathrow Airport, the transformation among the passengers was undeniable. The arrogance and superiority they had displayed earlier were gone, replaced by a newfound sense of humility. They had entered the flight as individuals accustomed to privilege and power, but they were leaving it with a deeper understanding of empathy and humanity. When the pilot announced their imminent arrival, Maria closed her book and tucked it back into her bag. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, smoothing out her dress. For the first time since boarding, the other passengers watched her with admiration rather than judgment. And as Maria stepped off the plane, she left behind not just a group of humbled travelers, but also a lasting reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and kindness always triumphs over cruelty. As the plane taxied to a stop at the gate, the first-class passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to disembark. But unlike any other flight, there was no rush, no jostling for position or impatient tapping of feet. Instead, an unusual calm settled over the cabin, as if everyone was moving in slow motion, each person lost in their own thoughts. The earlier chaos of apologies and revelations had given way to a collective sense of reflection. Maria stood quietly by her seat, adjusting the strap of her handbag and smoothing out the wrinkles in her dress. She didn't seem eager to leave, nor did she linger unnecessarily. Her movements were deliberate but unhurried, as though she understood the gravity of what had just unfolded, and how it would ripple through the lives of those around her. The line to exit the plane formed naturally, with passengers waiting patiently for their turn. But instead of filing past Maria without acknowledgement, something remarkable happened. One by one, as they reached her row, many paused briefly to offer a final word of gratitude or apology. A middle-aged man, his face still flushed, with embarrassment, stopped in front of her. "Thank you for handling everything with such grace," he said sincerely. "You've taught us all a lesson we won't forget." Maria smiled faintly, her eyes softening. "It's not about me," she replied gently. "It's about remembering that everyone deserves kindness no matter who they are or where they come from." Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those who heard them. Another passenger, a young woman clutching her carry-on bag tightly, nodded in agreement. "I'll never judge someone based on appearances again," she murmured. "Not after tonight." These small exchanges continued as the line moved forward, each interaction reinforcing the shift in perspective that had taken place during the flight. For some, it was a moment of closure. For others, it was a promise to do better in the future. Maria listened to each comment with quiet patience, offering a nod or a reassuring smile before letting them move on. By the time Maria stepped off the plane, the mood among the first-class passengers had transformed entirely. What had started as arrogance and mockery had evolved into humility and introspection. As they made their way through the airport terminal, many found themselves glancing back at her retreating figure, wondering how someone so unassuming could leave such a profound impact. Outside the plane, Alexander Hartley waited near the arrival gate, his tall frame standing out amidst the crowd. When Maria appeared, he greeted her with a warm embrace, whispering something softly into her ear. The Howard couple shared a brief laugh, their connection evident even from a distance. To anyone watching, they looked like two people deeply in love, equal partners bound by mutual respect and admiration. For the passengers trailing behind Maria, seeing Alexander again only reinforced the lesson they had learned. Here was a man who commanded respect on a global scale, yet he treated his wife with the same tenderness and devotion he showed to his business empire. It was a powerful reminder that true success isn't measured by wealth or status, it's measured by how. The days following the flight were unlike any others for the first-class passengers. Their lives, which had once revolved around routines of privilege and comfort, now felt altered in ways they couldn't quite explain. The memory of Maria Rodriguez lingered in their minds like an unshakable echo, reminding them of the lessons they had learned and the mistakes they had made. For some, the change was immediate and tangible. A businessman who had mocked Maria's appearance during the flight found himself questioning his own behavior in everyday interactions. On his way to a high-stakes meeting the next morning, he noticed a janitor mopping the floor of the office lobby. Instead of walking past without acknowledgement, as he usually did, he stopped and thanked the man for keeping the space clean. The janitor looked up, surprised but pleased, and offered a warm smile in return. That simple exchange left the businessman feeling lighter, as though he had taken one small step toward becoming a better version of himself. Others began making conscious efforts to challenge their assumptions about people. A socialite known for her glamorous lifestyle decided to volunteer at a local shelter, something she had never considered before. As she served meals to families struggling to make ends meet, she realized how easy it was to overlook the hardships of others when surrounded by luxury. One woman, in particular, caught her attention, a mother with tired eyes and worn clothes, holding her child's hand tightly. For a fleeting moment, she saw Maria in that stranger's face, someone whose worth couldn't be measured by outward appearances. Even the younger passengers, who prided themselves on being open-minded, discovered blind spots in their own thinking. A college student traveling home for the holidays struck up a conversation with an elderly man seated next to him on a train. Normally, he would have kept his earbuds in, lost in music or social media. But this time, he listened intently as the man shared stories about his life, how he had worked 2 jobs to send his kids to school, how proud he was of their achievements. By the end of the ride, the student felt grateful for the connection, realizing that meaningful conversations could happen with anyone, anywhere. Back in London, word of the incident spread beyond the passengers themselves. Social media played its part, amplifying the story until it reached thousands of people worldwide. Passengers from the flight began sharing their experiences online, recounting the events with raw honesty. Some posted lengthy reflections, while others shared short captions accompanied by photos of airplanes or clouds. Hashtags like #lessons in kindness and "don't judge a book by its cover" trended globally, sparking discussions about empathy, humility, and the dangers of judging others based on appearances. One passenger wrote a heartfelt post that resonated deeply with readers. "I laughed at a woman because she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Then I found out she was married to the CEO of the airline. But here's the thing. It shouldn't have mattered. Whether she was rich or poor, famous or unknown, she deserved respect. Tonight taught me that kindness costs nothing, but assumptions can cost everything." The comment section flooded with responses, many expressing admiration for the writer's courage in admitting their mistake. Others shared similar stories of times they had misjudged someone, vowing to do better in the future. Teachers used the post as a discussion topic in classrooms, encouraging students to reflect on the importance of treating everyone equally. Even news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a viral tale of redemption and self-awareness. But Amidst all the buzz, Maria remained blissfully unaware of the impact she had created. She hadn't sought recognition or validation. Her actions, or rather her quiet dignity, had spoken for themselves. After returning home, she slipped back into her usual routine, tending to her garden, reading books, and spending time with Alexander. To her, the flight was just another day, a brief encounter with strangers who happened to cross her path. Alexander, however, was more attuned to the ripple effect of that evening. He often teased Maria gently about her famous flight, but she brushed it off with a laugh. "They'll forget about it soon enough," she said, brushing dirt from her hands after planting a row of sunflowers. "It's not about me. It's about what they choose to take away from it." Her words stayed with him long after she walked inside. Alexander admired Maria's ability to rise above judgment, her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. It was one of the reasons he loved her so deeply. While the world obsessed over titles, wealth, and status, Maria valued something far greater: character. As weeks turned into months, the passengers continued carrying the lessons of that night with them. Some became advocates for kindness, speaking publicly about the importance of treating everyone with respect. A few even organized workshops and seminars, using their platforms to promote empathy and understanding. They called it the Maria Effect, a movement inspired by the quiet strength of a woman who had refused to let cruelty define her. In private moments, they reflected on how much they had grown since that flight. The businessman who had once dismissed Maria as insignificant now made it a habit to compliment the staff at restaurants and hotels, acknowledging their hard work. The socialite who had judged Maria's dress now donated generously to charities supporting women and children in need. And the college student who had scrolled mindlessly through his phone now engaged with strangers, seeking connections instead of distractions. Their transformations weren't dramatic or overnight. They were subtle shifts, like ripples spreading across water. But collectively, they represented something powerful: the idea that one person's grace can inspire countless others to be better versions of themselves. For Maria, life went on as it always had. She remained humble, content in her simplicity, and focused on what truly mattered: family, love, and kindness. Occasionally, she would receive letters from passengers thanking her for changing their perspective, but she rarely responded. "They don't need my approval," she told Alexander one evening, sipping tea on their porch. "What matters is that they've chosen to grow." And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of the story. Maria didn't set out to teach a lesson or leave a legacy. She simply lived her life with authenticity and compassion, trusting that her actions would speak louder than words. In doing so, she reminded everyone around her, including those who had doubted her, that true worth isn't defined by wealth, status, or appearances. It's defined by the way we treat others and the way we allow ourselves to be treated. Little did Maria know, her quiet strength had sparked a chain reaction that would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. And in a world often divided by judgment and prejudice, her story served as a beacon of hope, a reminder that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change hearts and heal wounds. Months had passed since that unforgettable flight, but the story of Maria Rodriguez refused to fade into obscurity. Instead, it continued to grow, spreading like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and even dinner table conversations. What started as a personal lesson for a handful of first-class passengers had evolved into something much bigger, a movement that challenged people to rethink how they interacted with the world around them. The phrase Maria Effect became a buzzword, used to describe moments when someone's quiet dignity or unexpected grace inspired others to reflect on their own behavior. Teachers incorporated the story into lessons about empathy. Business leaders cited it in speeches about workplace culture. Even talk show hosts invited experts to discuss the importance of looking beyond appearances and treating everyone with respect. The ripple effect of that single night was undeniable, and it showed no signs of stopping. For Alexander Hartley, the CEO of the airline, the aftermath was both heartwarming and humbling. He watched as his wife, without intending to, became a symbol of kindness and resilience. At first, he teased her about her newfound fame, calling her the accidental influencer. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel immense pride, not just because she was his wife, but because she represented everything good and decent in the world. Her ability to forgive, to rise above judgment, and to lead by example was nothing short of extraordinary. "People are drawn to you because you're real," Alexander told her one evening as they sat together on their porch watching the sunset. "You don't pretend to be anything you're not, and that's rare these days." Maria chuckled softly, brushing off the compliment. "I'm just living my life, Alex. If people see something in that, then maybe it's because they're searching for the same thing." Her words struck a chord with him. In a world obsessed with perfection, filtered photos, curated lifestyles, and constant self-promotion, Maria stood out precisely because she didn't try to. She wasn't flashy or loud. She simply existed authentically, embodying values that many had forgotten: humility, patience, and compassion. Meanwhile, the passengers from the flight carried the lessons they had learned into EV.